Welcome to our kickoff for season 4, Find Your Calling.
Glad to be here.
And we have the Josh Powers. Yay. I always like to ask people to give it up.
Is that like capital letters?
Oh, 100%. It's like the one and only Josh Powers.
Okay, come on.
So to give you a little background on Josh, first of all, he's been through a series of careers. I mean, just the ones that I know about is you started out, I don't even know if you started, but you were at one point when I met you, you were teaching and you were in a public school setting. Yep. You're kind of working your way up the ladder and you were just a volunteer, but you were volunteering like super incredibly at your church, which transitioned into a total career switch, which you became a middle school pastor and then a high school pastor. You left for a while and then you went into the nonprofit sector. Yes. So you have kind of like these 3 stages.
You're noticing this trend. There's
it's
a lot
like
of jumping
there's
around
movement, which I love because so many people, I think, joining this conversation about finding your calling, they're going to be stressed about, okay, which path do I choose?
How do I find the one thing I'm supposed to do in my whole life? And if I don't, it's all like not worth it. Yes,
right. That is why I'm tuning into a series called Find Your Calling, because I want to know like what kind of job do I want to go to the public sector? Do I want to go into the nonprofit? Do I want to work for a church? Yeah. And so you have a background in all of those. So I wanted to bring you on for this conversation. Currently, you are serving as you gave me your title, it was awesome, the executive pastor of glory for our Auburn campus launch.
That was lovingly placed upon.
Yes. You didn't choose it for yourself.
No,
it was given to you.
Thank you.
So, and if you've never been part of a church plant, that just basically means you're in charge of everything and anything and the weirdest things.
Figure out how to build it. Yeah. That's what we're doing.
I love it. And so we're so excited to have this conversation with you, Josh. In addition to all of that background, you've helped several of our staff as well as our second years navigate this question of calling. I know it's something that you're so passionate to have conversation with young college students just getting started in life. So our hope for you in this series, as you're tuning in, this is episode 1, is that you would end this series feeling like you have found your calling. Does that mean you're going to be 100% certain of it? No. But I want you to finish this series feeling like, I can answer the question, or at least I have the beginnings of an answer to the question of this is what my life's calling is. So kicking it off, Josh, let's talk about calling. Tell me your thoughts about this word.
Okay. First of all, I have some issues with the word calling.
Not
like deep-seated emotional issues, but I feel like it's so confusing, Dina, because it's tossed out there as this really big, weighty thing of like, find your calling. It's like there's this one needle in the haystack of life, and if your job is to find that. But as you said, I sit down with someone who's like 18, 25, 50. It's not like just a young people concept, younger. Right. It's a lot of people struggle with what is this idea of trying to take a really dynamic, fast-moving, crazy, confusing world. Whereas my story, as any indication, the amount of time you're at a job is like less and less. And so all these things that before it feels like people tell us, this is how you know you found your calling, is like you found the job or the career, or you can pay for stuff, or like there's all these random different ways to determine if you've actually made it, depending upon who you ask. And confusion reigns supreme this word. Yes. And so I feel like really it's helpful to sort of reframe it. I think calling has a very spiritual kind of end to it, like we talk about it when we're at church, it's called calling. And then like the rest of our life or our world, we call it purpose or passion or what you're really good at. I don't know. You can do it a lot of ways. And so that's just the first thing is I think there needs to be a little bit more flexibility around this. We know it's a biblical concept in that, yes, there are very clear concepts around call in Scripture. Yeah. Yes. But what do we do with the rest of that on a daily basis? And so most of the time when I sit down with someone who's like 19, they pull out a notebook and they're like, all right, I want to figure out my calling. Let's do this. I got 35 minutes. And we'll just go. And we're like, okay.
And at the end of it, could you tell me the college to go to that will help prepare me for that calling?
And the degree to choose and the insert here, all the other things. What's her name that I'm going to marry if it's a guy, and like all the random things that come up. And the first thing I literally say is, are you sure you want to ask that question yet? Or should we do a little bit more talking about you? And obviously everything gets thrown off at that point. Because usually the idea of calling is this thing beyond yourself that you're here to go find. My job when it comes to calling is like an A to B idea. Sorry, too much math, I know. But like you're A as a person and your job is to find calling, which is B. It's like this path you're supposed to find somehow, and then walk somehow, and then arrive somehow. It's very clear, even though no one knows how to do it. And if you start with this idea that like maybe it's not this thing beyond you outside of, and we need to start with you, that's usually what starts the conversation.
Wow. Okay, that's so helpful.
There's a lot there. We could probably unpack like 30 parts of that.
Yes. Okay, I want to come back to that concept in a minute. But going back to what you said about just the gravity of that word calling. First of all, if this conversation makes you anxious, that is the opposite of what we're going for.
Yes.
Like one of the things that we want to do, our thing that we do at Thrive College is we help prepare students for their calling. And the reason we chose that as the way to express what we think that is our best contribution to a college student's life is because there's so much dang confusion out there in this season. It's like, what college to go to? Should I go to college? Should I go to like YWAM? Should I go to one of these? There's just so much confusion in this season of life. And beyond that, what girl to date? And, should I make this decision? Should I just be about this career? Am I supposed to go into ministry? How can I serve God? What good life choices? We want to minimize confusion in people's lives. So if this conversation makes you anxious, just take a deep breath and know that's not what we're after. We feel like if you listen, give us the next 5 episodes, 6 including this one, you're going to end less confused. Now, not to say you don't have more questions, because we're going to give you some great questions along the way. But you won't feel anxious about those questions. That's the first thing. The second thing is that while this word calling is very spiritual and weighty, we feel like every single Christian has a calling in this particular sense. Not that there's this needle in a haystack and there's only one way to serve and please God with your life. Or that there's one job for you. But we feel like every Christian has a calling according to Scripture, and that there is important work that God has assigned for you to do. Meaning that when you wake up in the morning and you're wondering, is anyone going to miss me if I just don't go somewhere today? Is there a reason to get out of bed? The only answer from Scripture is yes. Your life matters. Your life counts. You are breathing. Your heart is beating because God has you alive for a purpose today. And our job is to help you find what that job is for you to do. What's the important work? That's what we mean by calling. What's the important work that God has called you to do? So that's our baseline definition.
Such a good repositioning of that exact thing. That's amazing.
Yes.
Come on.
Thank you. And we're grounding it in 2 scriptures. So first and foremost is the creation story. And so the creation story, if you haven't read it in a while, basically God creates all of these aspects of our world. And then he rolls up his metaphorical sleeves. He forms man out of the dust. He breathes his spirit into him, and then he gives him a mandate. He says to the male and the female that he wants them to be fruitful and to multiply. He wants them to be stewards of all creation. And what that means is there is work for us to do. From the very beginning of the story, we show up on the scene and God has a job that he has assigned to us. Fast forward all the way to Matthew 28, where Jesus is about to literally hand the baton. Actually, that would be the opposite of literally. Metaphorically hand the baton to his disciples. He's ascending into heaven. His work on earth in this chapter is finished. He's handing the baton and he says, all authority on heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, this is your job. This is your calling. This is what I'm asking you to do. This is your important work. Go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. Those are our 2 anchor points. If you get lost and you decide not to listen to the rest of the series, here you go. Do you know what you are called to? You are called to work. Genesis 1 and 2. And then also, you are called to make disciples. That's your general calling. Now, how that plays out, what your specific role is in work, what kind of work to do, what your specific role is in how to make disciples, that is the conversation we're going to have.
And I love the sort of bookends to that conversation you bring up, this idea that there's work to be done and that you're being sent out to do it, both in a spiritual and also practical sense. I don't think they're 2 separate things. I really, truly believe that if you have to separate what you do from your calling spiritually, we've missed the point of why the Genesis call exists. This idea that I think that sometimes I hear conversations of people going, okay, there's my spiritual gifts over here in this bucket, and there's my talents and skills like physically over here in this bucket, and then there's like calling, and they're like very separate things.
Yeah.
And the beauty of these two passages you bring up is I think they're linked together. So I think there's this beautiful thing that happens where if God is intimately knitting you together in your mother's womb, said David, and giving you a purpose that only uniquely you can fulfill, aka those two scriptures, don't you think that like when you then come under his authority and accept him as the purpose maker, he would entrust you with these spiritual gifts that walk hand in hand and enable you in a spiritually motivated and empowered via the Spirit way to do that work. So I don't think they're all separate conversations, but I think somewhere where it gets a little bit sideways is spiritual gifts seem very understood in that you take a test and then you read your Bible and like we know all the correct things to do.
Right.
And then it's like, okay, but what other things do I do really well? And the interesting part is most Christians don't actually do the digging to discover themselves when it comes to the what do I do well out there.
Yes.
They allow other people to define that for them. So the interesting part is we go, I know what it takes for me to grow spiritually in habits and formation and all these spiritual pieces, which are really necessary. Yeah. But then like I'll let my great aunt, Susie over here say that this one time I saw you be kind to someone, so like maybe I should like start a missions organization. You're like,
whoa,
how did we get
Elite.
there? That's quite a jump.
Yes.
Yeah. And so, man, I think there's like a real work to be done, not just to what you go out and do, but to who you are. So what, like, I have this great quote. I always forget who says it, and I always say it a little different way. But the gist is, before you go ask the world like what you're supposed to do in it, maybe you should ask yourself who you're supposed to discover inside first.
Wow.
This idea that if God made you on purpose for a purpose to do work he uniquely positioned you to do, part of the work is figure out how he put you together and then how the two things work together.
I love that. Okay, so diving into that, which my follow-up question, I feel like we're just moving here, was going to be, what advice would you give to someone just starting out in this conversation of finding their calling? Yeah. Sounds like the first place you're advising us to start is to actually do some self-exploration to figure out, who am I?
But not by yourself.
Okay, explain.
Okay, because we get in our own head and we are the best like salesperson for ourselves because we know exactly what we want to hear.
Or
it's
the
crazy.
worst.
Or the worst. Either way.
Just
You're like,
one
I'm not
direction.
Doing that.
Yeah.
Exactly. So don't just sit by yourself with a journal and think about all the things. Go find someone who you know well, who you trust, who's mature beyond you, not a peer, preferably.
Yes.
Someone who's a little advanced. This is not new. Jesus kind of did this all the time with the 12. And literally ask them to tell you things about yourself that you don't necessarily want to hear. It sounds scary and it sounds hard, but that will usually then lead into things that you do want to hear and so on and so forth. So the simplest way is find someone you trust that's older and ask them to tell you stuff about you.
That's good. A youth pastor, a small group leader, sometimes parents, if you have a good relationship with them, and just say, hey, tell me some things that I don't want to hear that might highlight some things that you need to work on. Yes. And then you're saying eventually the conversation can evolve to that more like, and then tell me some things, encourage me.
Yes.
Is there anything that you notice about me that I'm good at or decent or that I have potential in?
And the funny part about that, the reason why I say it in that order is because most of the time when I sit down with a person who loves Jesus and they're trying to figure this conversation out, they don't know where to start. They're really comfortable with the things they're not great at. The irony is, and the reason why I start with it is because it's almost like you ignore it. It's white noise. You're like, oh yeah, I know I struggle with that. And I know I'm not good with that. So it's like, start there, get it out of the way. Okay, now that we're done with that, I'll usually go, okay, what are all the things you struggle at? I'll like make me a list, and they'll literally pull out a notebook and they'll write like 10. I'll be like, give me 5. They'll give me like 10 as if it's like extra credit, right? I promise you I'm really aware of my weaknesses. Yes. And then I'll go, oh man, that's fantastic. Geez, I guess we should like spend some time here. But before we do that, on the other side of the page, I want you to just give me like 3 things that you're better at than most people you've ever known. And a lot of the time, like 98%, Dean, I'm not even making this up, like they won't even list one. For a couple reasons. Usually they'll say it feels like not humble.
Right.
To like say something
bragging.
Positive about myself. Or I legitimately don't know what to say.
Yeah.
And so this idea that like we can be so fully aware of these things that we want to grow in, fantastic. Let's go get accountability, have people that know your story and are in your corner. But also like, what does it look like to focus on what God actually built you to be great at doing?
Yeah.
Because that seems pretty important to being able to go accomplish work that's unique for you to do.
Yeah. Okay, Josh, we'll each share one just so that we can be the first in modeling. Like, this is an okay thing to do, is to name what you're great at. And we're not going to have to preface this by saying like, there's 10,000 things we're not great at. Like, obviously that's assumed. But what is one thing that you've discovered in the last several years, or maybe you just have always known that you are uniquely great at?
Yeah. So one thing is, and it's actually perfect for this conversation because God has put me together in a way where for some reason my brain has the ability to sit with a person and ask questions and have some like inklings of like where they need to go. But like, I'm not supposed to tell you, I'm supposed to understand a little bit of that, ask you some questions so that you start on the path and then just walk alongside you as we get toward there. Like, that's called discipleship in a way, very generally, but more specifically, it can come across sometimes as like, oh my gosh, how do you know these things about me that I don't know? And God very clearly was like, go do that. In a little bit, we'll talk about after you share how that's not just specific to this conversation, it spreads, but I want to hear yours first. What's yours?
That's good. I would say, like, since I was a young kid, I would go into Sunday school and they would just be like, wow, like, great job, Dina, like, great understanding of that Bible chapter. Like, you mastered the lesson. And I always assumed for the longest time, like, well, yeah, I'm a pastor's kid. That's kind of how it is.
I'm supposed to.
Yeah, like, I pay attention at home, when my dad's talking. But what I realized over time is like the feedback was consistent enough. And I started listening to everyone else being like, I just don't get this part of the Bible. And there was a long season where I tried to play humble Josh and I'd be like, oh yeah, me too. This is like so hard. But in my heart of hearts, like I knew
I have something to say. And it might help you actually.
Yeah, I was like, this actually like is not at all like hard what you're saying. Like I could explain this to you. I could help you understand this part of the Bible. So that's I've actually noticed that even just beyond the Bible, I have this gift from God of being able to take lots of different streams of information and simplify it and be able to share it in a way that other people can understand. So that's a gift I have. And for a long time, I just tried to be like really fake modest about it. Right. But now I'm just like, hey, there are a lot of people who have questions about the Bible. And that's one of my gifts. I can just be like, hey, I get that part of the Bible. Let me help you explain that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, if you think about, let me take that, like the fake humble piece. And I don't think that that's like a really major thing. I think it's literally, you don't even think about it. It's just like you're in the flow of life and this feels like I don't want to stand out and be other. Yeah. Like that I have something figured out when you don't. And this is not even stuff we like consciously decide to think about or feel or then act on. You just do. So like as we're saying this, you're probably sitting there at home, like, home wherever you're watching this going, okay, so like are there times that I do that? Dina, you crushed it. There's patterns that repeat. You said you noticed early on, from really early, I noticed that. Yeah. You will too at home, friend, wherever you're running, you're on the treadmill, you're doing something. You'll start to think if you're honest enough with yourself and you're having great conversations with that person we mentioned earlier, you can start to actually notice some things about you that keep cropping up. Yeah. Like another one of yours is probably a way that you did that was words were usually an important part. And somehow you could connect words that created meaning from complex to simple. It's like, I just do that. Yeah. But here's what we do. What we do is we get so used to the things that we know are naturally built into us that we actually in some cases can start to resent them or look down on them because before we know how to be entrusted responsibly to like use those for God's kingdom advancement, we can use those for our own advancement gains, whatever you want. Yeah. So the ability to use words to move people to action is something that I would say is like God has asked me to do. Well, when like 12-year-old Josh is running around out here, like it could be used negatively, right? And so I learned to dislike, not just dislike, I learned to like ask God to remove that thing from me so that I could be more aligned with him. Yeah. The irony being, the one thing that I've become so consistently used to seeing is the thing that he put me on earth to uniquely do the work of Genesis and the Great Commission. And so I think that most of the time, if we slow down enough and spend some time in really good conversation, this isn't a great mystery. Like God isn't trying to intentionally mislead us down a wrong path. He's hoping that we not only discover them, but deploy them so that everything goes better.
That's so good. I feel like, one of the exercises you can walk out of this podcast and do is to sit down and just, make a list of things that, even if it's just one or two things that from childhood, you're just like, I just feel like this came naturally to me. This came easily to me.
This is what I always used to get yelled at most by my sister or like my parents. Yeah, explore those. That's fun.
That's so good. So just start there and then take that into conversation with older, wiser people. Take that into conversation with God and just say, all right, this is maybe just a clue, a signpost to my calling. Let's start the conversation.
And there's the permission, a clue and a signpost. This isn't from 0 to 100.
Yeah.
So you said a little earlier, there's so much pressure in this period. This is just a continuation. There was pressure from when you were like 10.
Yeah.
And you're like choosing colleges and taking SAT prep classes when you're like 11. Like these days are insane. And the pressure to just know is so high that this feels like another one of those areas where if I decide to actually start to jump into that a little bit, I don't know if I'll actually want to discover what's there, because I'll just have more stuff that will stress me out and overwhelm me. Right. So here's the permission and the freedom in that is what you'll find is the more that you start to have this conversation and really truly look at it and be real, is actually you'll start to find that you come alive a little bit. Like if you notice, like both of us as we were going, hey, this we're like sit up, we lean in, we just get really juiced up about it. Why? Because that's how you're put together. Yeah. It's not supposed to be this mystery. It's freedom.
That's so good. Okay, so let's say that's the first piece of advice, the action of sitting down with an older, wiser person, which will lead into this question of what am I great at or what comes naturally to me. What would be your next piece of advice for someone that wants to find their calling? Yeah,
I would say spend a fair amount of your spiritual formation time around this concept. Like if it's just, okay, God, I got my check boxes today. If I spent time in the Word and like I threw up a couple prayers, like again, not trying to be flippant on that. Let's go. There's some days when that feels like a huge win, but like how much time are you really truly going, all right, God, like I am all in on the best that you have for me in this specific area. Would you continue to lead and guide me? It's a small tweak, but I feel like sometimes can just be so far out. Yeah. And sometimes I've heard people push back and go, no, it's not just about discovering yourself and feeling good about your feelings and that answers all the questions. I'm like, no, it's so much more than that. Yeah. But let's start. So that being one small piece, incorporating it into your spiritual time. The other thing being, I think we need to reframe a little bit what we talk about when we talk about the goal. So most of the time when I have conversations with folks, and a mentor a while ago shared this with me, and I was like, that's a better way of saying it than the way I always used to. Yeah. It's like this idea of multiple levels. So we think about, okay, early on you pay your dues, you have a job. It's just a job, you're waiting tables, you're flipping burgers. You do this thing that's like lower level, but eventually like all advance, okay? Yeah. And then, beyond that, you've got like a career, and then like beyond that, you've got a calling. And there's like these 3 levels, and like I'm not really sure how they interact or what they do, but I think they exist. All I know is if I pay my dues at the bottom, I work my way to the top. Someone said that one time, right? Okay. And the hard part about that, Dina, is that like, again, you're not actually paying attention to why you're in these spots. You're just like doing things. Right. It's like you have to, as we all know, learn lessons at the JOB that you take with you. But I think it's more than that. I think so much of the time we actually flip the top 2 where it's, job and career and calling. Calling is like the highest form of recognizing our fullness in what God made us to be. And we actually flip it so that we say, okay, I do this job that I don't really care about maybe so that I discover my calling. And once I've done the hard stuff in a job and put in my time and I've discovered my calling, now I find my career. Right. And somehow what we've done in that is we've like completely turned on its head God's point of us being in the Genesis and Great Commission call. Yes. That like a career is now the main goal. That like a calling somehow serves your career ambition. Right. Which like, okay, maybe that could work out in some instance, but if you think about mentally what that does, that means that I'm taking things that I normally attribute or connect to a career, and those are now above a concept of calling, whether it's spiritual or otherwise. Yeah. Amount of money you make, neighborhood you live in, who you marry, all those things that are attributed with career success have now been made more important than calling. So first and foremost, as we're talking about this next level, I think you make sure you keep those moved around because that's massive. Yeah. And that can be a major source of trip up in terms of like extra anxiety in this conversation. Is calling can be something that is fluid. You can do anywhere, anytime, any place.
But sometimes career is like, there's this pathway to this career. And even job can feel very locked in. Like, man, this job is completely disconnected from my calling. I bet you there's a way for you to do your calling at that job.
And the perfect example of that, Dina, is part of my jumping around. One thing that I know gives me life is this conversation. There's a reason why I can lean on all these conversations I've had with someone who's 19, because I love it. It takes all these pieces of me that I'm discovering, continuing, like present, not discovered, that I'm discovering. And I know that, like, no matter what's going on in my job or career, this is calling level stuff.
Yeah.
And the beauty of that is when you feel like you're stuck in a job, the answer isn't jumping to another job. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. But the real freedom is you can, no matter what you're doing, take calling and infuse it into that thing you're doing, and it gives life again.
That's so good. So, and just really practically, you're living this out because you're an executive pastor of Glory at the Auburn campus lunch. And there's like, yeah, right. Your task list is long, right? Yeah. And so if you had no awareness of what your overall life calling was, that you had been given this special gift of being able to ask questions and lead people or direct people to ask these questions, which will send them down a direction, which will help them in the future to find their calling. If you didn't know that about yourself, when I said, hey, Josh, can you do this podcast with me about finding your calling? You would have probably just looked at your task list and been like, that's not on my job description. That's nothing to do with the Auburn campus launch. And so, that's going to be a no for me. But because you've done the work of knowing your calling, you're just like, hey, okay, well, this aligns with what God has gifted me to do. So it's going to be a yes, even though that makes the rest of my job a little bit more complicated this week.
And the other part of that exact same thing is, it is one of the only things that actually enables me to do the job parts of the job.
Right.
Because we always have those. No matter how much you love your job, career, whatever, there's always parts that are harder than the parts that are easier.
That's right.
So what do? Just like promise you'll try harder this time and have them cost you less emotionally, spiritually, like energy-wise?
Yeah.
Or are you intentional about learning about the things that God put in you to fill you up so that you plug them in on purpose and everything is better because of it?
That's so good. Because there are some people in here right now that are like, my life is math class and SAT prep and just all of these absolutely drudgery things. Like I'm hating junior year. Like that's something I hear all the time. Junior year is the worst. And then senior year, you're just like, why am I still here?
You got to grind in junior year to cruise senior year. It's how it goes.
Or maybe you're a freshman in college and you're just like, whoa, this is college and this class is lame. And you can get caught in the drudgery of life and just be like, you want to throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, okay, apparently wrong college, apparently wrong direction for my life. Maybe it's more about saying, okay, God, open my eyes to the people around me, to the opportunities around me, and how you've uniquely situated me here, right now, to do what you have gifted me to do to help the people who are right here around me.
Oh my gosh, it's so good. And the reason why it's so good is because when you're actually leaning into this idea properly, I will say, of like what calling is, it's actually permission to create new opportunities instead of feeling burdened by things that you can't control.
Yeah.
You can't always stop school
That's
or
right.
leave a job or decide to not be in high school anymore. I mean, I guess you kind of can, but like sometimes there's things beyond your control. So then what? Do you wait for the calling over there when it gets better? Right. Or does this become an opportunity to, because you know how God has put you together, you're discovering that more, you just bring that into the conversation that's fresh and new, and it makes things move in a different way. Perfect example of that. Years ago, it's like probably 8 years ago, I was a middle school pastor, and I helped a student start a Bible club on his campus. And, he's an 8th grader, he's cruising through, he's waiting to get to high school. You're in that like in-between period. And I remember him saying something to me, it was really interesting. He said, I'm not sure why I'm here. It feels like I show up every day and it's kind of pointless. I'm like, wow, we've gotten here early, but like just save it for a couple years.
Grade. Yeah.
And then he's like, hey, I'm going to start a Bible club. And I was like, wow, this feels like a big jump for you. Like I didn't know that was a thing that you wanted to be a part of. And he goes, I decided that I wanted to make the time I had here actually mean something.
Wow.
That was early on, and even me seeing how I can incorporate some of these things, because here's the real secret is this isn't a discovered concept, like it's some target on the wall, and if you get it right, it's like a continual humility that's relearned every time you realize and rediscover a new aspect, a new perspective, a new portion.
That's so good. Okay, I'm going to shift gears a little bit because I feel like some people listening are like, okay, tell me more about your 3 different careers. And you may have had more that I'm aware of. Tell me about your 3 different careers. And to anyone who, because I do think the career conversation does matter as an aspect of if someone has the freedom and they're wondering which career path to go down. Tell us pros, cons of working for a church versus working in the secular world versus maybe working for a nonprofit. Just tell us about those 3 different worlds if we have the freedom and we get to kind of choose a lane to pursue.
Yeah, I think first and foremost, just be open to trying. I mean, I had this weird journey as part of my story is like I didn't really want any of those jobs per se. Like God, like for whatever reason, God just took me from like place to place. Ironically, at one point, I played baseball a lot growing up. I played through college and different things. And I had a coach tell me, you're going to coach and you're going to teach. And my literal first thing I said to him was, I would never teach because I have too many teachers in my family. And I know they're like underappreciated and underpaid. And that sounds horrible. It's like, I'm not going to do that. Check that one thing off the list. But here's the irony is like people are always throwing out random things that you would be great at, right? Like here's, great Aunt Sally again. And you're like, I don't even know what to do with that. And so you just keep moving forward, keep making the best decision you know how, trusting that God's call is the thing that you're continually discovering. And regardless of, like you said, you have freedom to choose. You're not walking into these things blind. I knew that there was things about any of these that I got involved with that I would be really, really good at doing. But they were at a micro level, not a macro level. Let me unpack that really quick. I think sometimes when we evaluate, like, what do I do for a job? What do I do for a career? It goes instantly to macro. What's the earning potential? Can I coach my kid's softball team one day? Like big, huge questions. Go to the micro instead is what I've always done. I don't know if that's right or wrong. It's these jobs have a lot to do with people. I really like people. If you don't like people, that eliminates a whole lot of job opportunities. Like start there.
Vice versa. If you do want to be with people, that eliminates a whole bunch of jobs.
Exactly right. Yeah. There's if you're hey, I could go into business because my dad's a CPA. If you know, you know, and like I could work in his firm, and that's great. But like I can't stand numbers, and I love people, and I don't really want to do anything on a computer. Like you should probably not go that direction.
That is an underappreciated observation.
Thank you. There's part of it that is like, okay,
don't just take that easy path because it's been paved for you.
Go micro on it and or do that knowing that you're expecting something maybe to not fit. Like maybe there is wisdom in that. So I guess what I'm saying here, Dina, is as really confusing as I've probably made it worse. There isn't a right or a wrong way to do this. I think that God is going to build trust from us in him, regardless of whether we make the correct choice, because God has again and again through my journey, almost every time I've made one of these kind of seemingly random, drastic jumps from career to career, God has got me to the point of I wanted to be obedient. That's what I wanted most. And when I prayed about it, when I talked with people about it, it felt like God said, you could be obedient by staying exactly where you are, or you could go, you choose.
Wow.
The craziest thing is it feels like we often think, hey, let me put out my fleece and see if God tells me what to do or what not to do. But I think the biggest form of God stretching us is when he gives us the ability to choose. And that's been a part of my story. So you will have the chance to choose. And you're going to choose what other people might tell you would be a wrong choice. Go in pursuit of what God has and know that he's going to teach you invaluable lessons as a part of that process.
That's really good. So a cautionary tale as part of this conversation is that sometimes when you hear that word calling, back to the idea of calling, is you just instantly think, okay, well then that must mean I work for a church. Or at the very least, like the most removed would be a nonprofit that builds the kingdom. And I just kind of want to say that's a no. There are lots of ways to serve God's kingdom and to do holy work that builds his kingdom that is outside the church. So let's be frank here, because we've both worked in the church and we've actually both worked outside the church. I was a substitute school teacher for a season. And it was a whole thing.
That's a lot.
But so advantages of working in the church, I think you get to, hopefully, if you're working for a great church, you get to be with people that love the Lord. And so that can be a major pro. You'll experience less persecution. con of working for the church is that you have an expectation of how church people are going to act.
Yep.
You expect them, fairly so, to act like Jesus, because that's kind of the gig, right?
on.
That's, we can't be preaching
That's
a
the model.
standard
Yeah.
and then, but that's not true,
No.
right? People are people. And, if you're going to work for a church, something that you need to be aware of is that it's very messy and it's full of broken people. And some people have entered into ministry and have found, wow, that's not my preferred way to do spirituality. That's not my preferred way to be with the people of God, is to work through all the mess that comes with working with messy people. That's just, I don't want that for my family. I don't want them to see the underbelly of the church. And so I am going to serve God outside the kingdom. Whereas like a major con of working for a church is that you are now signing up to have to work through all the messiness that comes with working with broken people inside the church.
Yeah.
Whereas outside the church, you can just be like, yeah, well, they're not a believer, or maybe they go to a bad church. Like I don't have to do this mental reconciliation and forgiveness all the time.
It's a great point.
Anything else that you're just like, hey, this is how you can serve God outside of the four walls of the church in a really wonderful, beautiful way.
Yeah.
Don't sell yourself short if you're considering that.
Absolutely. I mean, let's continue this same conversation we've been having. As you're being faithful and obedient to discover these pieces of who God has made you to be and how that leads you into passion, purpose, calling, whatever you want to call it, like that is the whole, you're on fire for things that maybe someone else isn't.
Yeah.
I found that like the most interesting thing to other folks who don't follow Jesus about me is the areas that I'm really passionate about. They ask me, why do you spend time you don't have hanging with 22-year-olds? Like, what is that? You do that all the time. And I'm like, it's the greatest thing I can do. And they're like, what are you talking about? That's a Jesus conversation right there.
Yeah.
And it had nothing to do with them knowing I was working at a church or any of that. So I will truly say, if you were God's plan A and he built you on purpose to live a certain way with gifts that he built into you and then gave you spiritual gifts, like, don't you think living that out creates opportunities to share him?
That's right.
So as simply as I can say, like kind of didn't answer the question, but that happens wherever you're at. And ironically, it's harder to do that sometimes when you work at a church. You can more fully do that, and it means more. Oh my gosh, like you give back to the community. Like you're a A+ insert here job worker person, right? I would never give my free time to go hang out with middle schoolers at a camp. Tell me more about your story.
Right.
It almost becomes easier, whereas you work in a church, it's baked in. You're supposed to do that. That's part of the gig.
Yeah.
And you almost have to like work to separate a little bit how to make that unique. So I am not saying that is like a reason to not work at a church or whatever. It's just to your point. There's realities in both of these conversations. And again, the freedom, the reminder, you don't have to have this figured out and have a sure opinion of how it's going to go for you before you say yes. I'm always someone who would way rather land on the side of say yes and trust that God will lead me than let me make sure I have everything figured out first before I do anything.
I love that. I remember talking to a really good friend, Mackenzie, and coming into Thrive College, she worked on our staff for a while. She was like, hey, my biggest hesitation about coming and working for Thrive College is I'm not going to be around a lot of lost people. And Mackenzie, she's so incredible. And I was just like, I can't, like, there's nothing I can say about that. That's facts. Like, unless you maybe take a Wednesday and go spend your time like at a high school, but like you're 9 to 5, you're going to be around Christians.
Right.
And so she shared that was her big hesitation. She worked on our team for a few years and then she decided to go get her MBA. And I remember talking to her afterwards and I was just like, how's it going? She's like, I love being around lost people.
Yeah.
Like I missed this. It was exactly what I thought. And I do miss aspects of serving God within the church. But it is so nice to know that my every conversation can count for someone's eternity, and in a way that working inside the four walls of a church doesn't. Just want to encourage you. There are some of you with gifts and passions, and if you follow those gifts, you follow those passions like we're encouraging you to do, they will lead you to take a job, pursue a career, and live out your calling outside the walls of ministry within the church. And that is good. That's great. That is the way that Jesus designed it. If we all worked for the church, that's really impractical. First of all, there would be no one actually bringing money into the church because church pastors don't make a lot of money. But then also there would be no one going out and doing the work of ministry in their 9 to 5. Yeah. So don't be afraid to chase this question outside the walls of ministry within the four walls of the church.
And the encouragement there that's beautiful is, how often are you making decisions that increase your faith versus decrease it? Mm-hmm. Sometimes around this conversation, it's like, if I figure all the right things out, I'll know. Well, like, you don't need faith then.
Yeah.
So again, I'm not saying make unwise decisions, but Mackenzie is a perfect example in that. You have way more perspective on how much you love being in the position you are now. And that's directly because of the fact that you chose to not be in that for a while by working at a church.
Exactly.
And so this idea
she was willing
that,
to take a risk.
Again, like I made a wrong decision in my career because I spent 4 years at a church. I'm like, I don't know.
Yeah.
I think you're better at this because you did. So again, like this freedom piece of you're gonna make decisions that you look back on and go, that made things harder. But I would really encourage you to go, man, have this conversation and don't be afraid to pursue what comes of it, because at the end of the day, God wants us to live a courageous and empowered and go get it kind of life, and not a cautious, I got to make sure I have all the things lined up first kind of life.
Perfect. Well, as we're wrapping up, is there anything else that you want to say in regards to finding your calling?
I mean, I feel like I've said so many things,
yes,
so probably not, but
I'm good to camp on where we landed. I feel like the call to be courageous in this conversation is exactly where I want to leave off. Just to let you know where the series is going, I sat down with some students at our Unleashed conversation, and we just had some really great, honest conversations about what does this conversation about calling look like in this season. And then we also sat down with some incredible artists such as Brandon and Megan Faith Marshman came and spoke at our Unleashed conference, Carl Romas, and we had some incredible conversations, Chris Hilkin, about how we can find our calling. Wow. So definitely stick with us throughout the course of the conversation. There's going to be so many gold nuggets. But as we're ending this episode, just want to encourage you, be courageous in this conversation, and let's see how you find your calling.
Let's find it.